close your eyes for just a moment. Imagine waking up at the age of 7, ripped from your mother's arms, handed nothing but a single thin cloak, and told that from this day forward, the only family you have is war. No comfort, no mercy, no second chances. What kind of civilization does that to its children? And more terrifyingly, what kind of children does that civilization produce? The answer has echoed through 26 centuries of human history, and it still sends a chill down the spine of anyone who truly understands it. This is not the Sparta of Hollywood movies. This is something far darker, far more complex, and far more fascinating than you have ever been told. The city-state of Sparta, known to its own people as Lacedaemon, was not built on gold or trade or philosophy. It was built on iron. Every single institution, every law, every custom, every meal, every breath that a Spartan took from the moment of birth to the moment of death was designed with a single, obsessive purpose: to create the most lethal human being that the ancient world had ever seen. And they succeeded. For nearly 3 centuries, the Spartan army was essentially undefeated in pitched land battle. Not because they were lucky, not because they had better weapons, but because they had turned the human body and the human mind into instruments of war so perfectly calibrated that their enemies sometimes surrendered before the fighting even began. What does it take to build a machine like that? The answer is as brutal as you would expect, and stranger than you could imagine. Before a Spartan child ever saw the inside of a training ground, they faced their first test, and they hadn't even learned to walk yet. In Sparta, every newborn was brought before a council of elders called the Gerousia within days of birth. These men, weathered and cold-eyed, examined the infant with the detachment of engineers inspecting a product. They were looking for strength, for proportion, for the physical promise of a future warrior. If the child appeared weak, sickly, or malformed, the elders made a decision that most modern people find almost impossible to comprehend. The infant was taken to a place called the Apothetai, a chasm near the base of Mount Taygetos, and left there to die. This was not considered cruelty in Sparta. It was considered logic. A city built entirely on military supremacy could not afford to invest its resources in a body that might never serve the phalanx. The child who survived that first inspection had already, without knowing it, passed the first test of what would become a lifetime of them. What is extraordinary is that this system of selection did not harden Spartan mothers into cold, unfeeling creatures. It did something far more complicated. It created a culture where Spartan women openly celebrated the warrior ideal in ways that shocked the rest of Greece. There are recorded accounts of Spartan mothers sending their sons off to battle with a phrase that has become one of the most famous in all of military history. "With your shield or on it," they reportedly said, meaning return victorious, carrying your shield, or return dead, carried upon it as a bier. A Spartan warrior who threw down his heavy shield and ran was considered the worst kind of coward, because the shield was not just protection for the individual. It was the wall of the entire formation. To abandon it was to abandon every man beside you. These mothers understood that. They had been trained to understand it from the time they were girls, in a society that expected women to be as mentally tough as the men they raised. The training system that forged Spartan warriors is known to history by the Greek word agoge, which roughly translates to the rearing or the upbringing. But those gentle translations do absolutely no justice to what the agoge actually was. It was, in its most essential form, a state-controlled program of systematic physical, psychological, and social transformation that lasted from the age of 7 all the way to 30 years old. For 23 years, a Spartan male was the property of the state. Not his parents. Not himself. The state. Every day of those 23 years was structured around one overarching goal: the destruction of individual weakness and the construction of collective invincibility. The agoge is often compared by modern scholars to military boot camps, but that comparison flatters modern boot camps more than it describes the agoge. What happened in Sparta was something on a completely different level of intensity and duration, and the results were correspondingly extraordinary. When boys entered the agoge at 7 years old, they were organized into units called agelai, herds, essentially, which is a telling choice of word, since the Spartans viewed unformed boys as animals that needed to be shaped. Each agoge was supervised by an older youth called an irene, typically around 20 years old, who had already survived the worst of the training and was now responsible for hardening the next generation. The irene was not a gentle teacher. He was a disciplinarian, a drill instructor, and something between a coach and a warden. He had the authority to punish boys physically, and he used that authority constantly. But here is what is truly fascinating. The irene was also being evaluated based on how well his charges performed. If the boys in his unit were soft, if they flinched, if they failed, it reflected on him. So every irene had a very personal stake in making every boy in his care as tough as humanly possible. The entire system was self-reinforcing, layer upon layer of accountability, pushing every participant toward harder, faster, stronger. The Spartan boys were deliberately kept hungry. This was not neglect, it was doctrine. Spartan authorities believed that hunger sharpened the mind, kept the body lean and mobile, and most importantly, trained the boys in the art of resourcefulness. Boys in the agoge were expected to supplement their meager rations by stealing food from farms, storehouses, and even public messes. If they succeeded, they ate. If they were caught, not for stealing but for being clumsy enough to get caught, they were beaten. The lesson was precise and intentional. A Spartan warrior on campaign might find himself behind enemy lines with no supplies. The ability to take what was needed without detection was not a criminal skill. It was a survival skill. There is even a famous story, almost certainly legendary but deeply revealing of Spartan values, of a boy who stole a live fox, hid it under his cloak, and allowed the animal to gnaw through his stomach rather than reveal what he had done. He died without making a sound. Whether literally true or not, the fact that Spartans told that story admiringly says everything about what they valued. Sleep deprivation was woven into the fabric of the agoge in ways that modern sleep science would find genuinely alarming. Spartan boys were not given beds. They were required to make their own sleeping mats from reeds they cut themselves from the river Eurotas, without using a knife, because knives were not permitted. Think about what that means. A 7-year-old boy must go to the river, rip reeds from the muddy bank with his bare hands, drag them back, and fashion something resembling a sleeping surface from them, all while exhausted from a day of running, wrestling, fighting, and marching. In winter, they were sometimes permitted to add a layer of thistle, a plant covered in spines, which supposedly generated warmth through some property the Spartans believed in. The suffering involved was considered entirely beside the point. Boys who cried, who complained, who showed visible pain were marked as weak. Boys who endured in silence were marked as promising. The language of the body, stoic, controlled, unreadable, was itself a form of discipline that the agoge hammered into every participant from the very first day. There is a quality about Spartan speech that the ancient world found both impressive and deeply unsettling. The Spartans were famous throughout Greece for saying as little as possible and meaning every word of what they said. The word laconic, which we still use today to describe someone who speaks in brief, pointed phrases, comes directly from Laconia, the region of Greece where Sparta was located. This was not merely a cultural preference for quiet. It was the deliberate product of a training system that viewed excessive speech as a form of weakness, a hemorrhaging of thought that should be conserved and weaponized rather than spilled carelessly. Spartan boys were trained to give short, sharp answers to difficult questions under pressure. Spartan officers were expected to communicate complex battlefield instructions in the fewest words possible. When the Persian king Xerxes sent a message to the Spartan king Leonidas demanding that the Greeks lay down their arms, Leonidas reportedly replied with 2 words, "Come and take them." In Greek, that is a single word, molin labe, and it has been the motto of warriors ever since. What made Spartan society structurally unique in the ancient Greek world was the existence of an enormous enslaved underclass called the helots. The helots were not slaves in the traditional ancient sense. They were not purchased individuals with individual owners. They were an entire conquered people, the original inhabitants of Laconia and the neighboring region of Messenia, who had been subjugated by Sparta generations earlier and reduced to a collective bondage. They farmed the land. They produced the food. They performed essentially all of the labor that kept Spartan civilization functioning. And they vastly outnumbered their Spartan masters. By some estimates, There were 7 helots for every Spartan citizen. 7 to 1. Think about what that ratio means for the people doing the dominating. The Spartans were not just warriors by philosophical choice. They were warriors by existential necessity. A city perpetually sitting atop a volcano of suppressed human rage had to be militarily unassailable at all times, or it would be consumed. The relationship between the Spartans and the helots produced one of the most disturbing institutions in all of ancient history, an annual ritual of state-sanctioned violence called the Cryptia. Each year, the ephors, who were Sparta's most powerful elected magistrates, would formally declare war on the helots. This was not a metaphor or a legal fiction. It was a literal declaration. And its purpose was specific. It allowed young Spartan men, typically those just emerging from the most intense years of the agoge, to hunt helots by night. They would move through the countryside in darkness, armed with daggers, targeting helots who seemed too strong, too charismatic, too potentially threatening. The Cryptia served multiple purposes simultaneously. It was a live-fire stealth training exercise for young warriors who needed real experience. It was a systematic terror campaign designed to prevent helot uprisings by eliminating potential leaders. And it was a psychological test, because to kill in cold blood, in darkness, without ceremony, required a particular kind of internal architecture that the Spartans deliberately cultivated. The fear that the Spartans carried about a helot uprising was not paranoid fantasy, it was historically grounded. Around 464 BC, a massive earthquake struck Sparta, killing thousands of Spartan citizens and destabilizing the social order just enough for the helots of Messenia to see their opening. They rose in rebellion, a revolt so serious and so prolonged that it took years for Sparta to suppress it. The revolt shook Spartan society to its foundations, reinforcing every paranoid instinct about the need for absolute internal control. What is striking to modern historians is how this constant fear shaped Spartan culture in ways that went far beyond the Cryptia. The entire military structure of Sparta, its obsession with physical readiness, its contempt for leisure and wealth, its insistence that every male citizen remain a full-time soldier for the prime decades of his life, all of it was at least partly driven by the knowledge that the moment Spartan warriors lost their edge, the people they had enslaved would take everything back. Spartan women occupied a position in the ancient world so radically different from that of women in Athens or any other Greek city-state that visiting Greeks often described them with a mixture of admiration and scandal. In Athens, women were confined largely to the home, excluded from public life, and expected to be modest, quiet, and invisible. In Sparta, women exercised in public. They competed in athletic events. They could own property. They could conduct business. They managed entire estates while their husbands spent the majority of their adult lives in the communal barracks of the Spartan military system. Spartan women were educated, not in philosophy as men were in Athens, but in practical intelligence, physical strength, and the psychological fortitude necessary to raise warriors and endure the loss of them. The poet Gorgo, daughter of one Spartan king and wife of another, when asked by a visiting Athenian woman why Spartan women seemed to command their men, reportedly replied, "Because we are the only women who give birth to real men." The physical education of Spartan girls was a source of constant astonishment to the rest of the Greek world. While their Athenian counterparts were kept indoors and taught weaving and domestic arts, Spartan girls ran. They wrestled. They threw the discus and the javelin. They competed in races and were trained in endurance and strength in ways that would have been considered shameful or even dangerous for women in virtually every other ancient civilization. The reasoning behind this was characteristically Spartan in its pragmatism. A strong mother produces strong children. The physical fitness of women was not a social experiment or an expression of gender equality. It was military policy by another name. If the bodies of Spartan women were temples, they were temples dedicated to the production of warriors, and everything about their upbringing reflected that purpose. But the unintended consequence, or perhaps the entirely intended one, was a class of women who were genuinely formidable human beings, psychologically and physically, in a way that no other ancient culture quite managed to produce. The Spartan mess hall, called the Syssicion, was one of the most socially important institutions in the entire city-state, and also one of the most equalizing in a deeply Spartan way. Every male Spartan citizen, regardless of his wealth or family lineage, was required to belong to a common mess of about 15 men. They ate together, they trained together, and in many ways they lived together as a unit that superseded even family bonds. Each member was required to contribute a fixed monthly amount of food, barley, wine, figs, cheese, from his personal landholding. A man who could not make his contribution, for whatever reason, lost his citizenship. Not his wealth, not his status, his citizenship. He became a hypomean, an inferior, stripped of the right to vote, to hold office, or to fight in the phalanx. This was a remarkable social mechanism. It meant that Spartan citizenship was not inherited at birth and then held automatically for life. It had to be earned continuously, month after month, through the simple act of contributing to the collective. Individual wealth meant almost nothing. The group was everything. The food served at the Spartan session was famously, almost legendarily, terrible. The centerpiece of every meal was a dish called black broth, a thick, dark concoction made from boiled pork, blood, salt, and vinegar. It has been described by ancient writers as deeply unpleasant. A man from Sybaris, a Greek city-state so associated with luxury and pleasure that it gave us the word Sybarite, once reportedly tasted it and said that now he understood why the Spartans were not afraid to die, because death could not possibly be worse than this food. The Spartans found that story hilarious, because they understood perfectly well that the point of the black broth was not nutrition or pleasure. The point was the reminder. Every meal was a reminder that comfort was irrelevant, that the body needed fuel, not reward, and that the man who learned to eat anything could survive anywhere. A Spartan army on campaign was almost impossible to demoralize through hunger, because hunger was simply a state they had trained in for their entire lives. The weapons of the Spartan warrior were deceptively simple, and that simplicity was itself a form of psychological statement. The primary weapon was the dory, a spear roughly 8 to 9 feet long, tipped with an iron point at one end and a bronze spike called a sauroder, or lizard killer, at the other. The sauroder served a double purpose. It could be planted in the ground to stabilize the spear during rest, and if the spear shaft broke in the heat of battle, the warrior could flip the weapon and fight with the bronze spike as a secondary point. The secondary weapon was the xiphos, a short, double-edged iron sword designed not for slashing but for thrusting in close quarters. The shield, called the hoplon, was enormous, roughly 3 feet in diameter, concave on the interior to rest on the forearm and grip with the hand, and heavy enough that carrying it across a battlefield was itself a feat of endurance. The Spartan approach to weaponry was the same as their approach to everything else. Ruthlessly functional, nothing wasted, every element serving a precise purpose. The formation that made the Spartan army so terrifying was called the phalanx, a tight block of warriors standing shield to shield, spears extended forward in a bristling wall of iron points. The genius of the phalanx was not merely physical, it was psychological. When it worked because every single man in the formation trusted without reservation that the man beside him would hold his position no matter what. If one man panicked and broke, if one gap opened in that wall of shields, the formation could collapse and every man in it could die. The phalanx was, therefore, not just a military tactic. It was a social technology. It required a level of mutual trust and shared courage that had to be built over years, not trained in weeks. This is why the Spartan system of eating together, sleeping in the same barracks, and training side by side from childhood was not social bonding for its own sake. It was the foundational engineering that made the phalanx work. The men in that formation were not strangers following orders. They were brothers who had bled together since they were 7 years old. One of the most psychologically sophisticated aspects of Spartan military culture was the way it approached the concept of fear. The Spartans did not claim to be fearless, that would have been a fantasy, and Spartans had no patience for fantasies. They knew what fear was. They had felt it. What they trained for, obsessively and methodically, was the ability to function in the presence of fear. To feel the cold spreading through the chest as an enemy formation advanced and still hold the line. To watch the man beside you take a spear to the throat and still advance forward instead of stepping back. Modern military psychology has a term for this: stress inoculation, the deliberate exposure to increasingly intense simulations of combat conditions until the nervous system learns to operate effectively under extreme stress rather than shutting down. The Spartans discovered this principle empirically, without the benefit of any psychological theory, simply through thousands of years of observation about what actually produced soldiers who did not break. The agoge was, in its deepest function, the world's first and most thorough stress inoculation program. There is a ceremony in Spartan culture that stands as perhaps the most direct expression of how the Spartans thought about pain, endurance, and the boundary between weakness and strength. At the altar of Artemis Orthia, a sanctuary dedicated to a version of the goddess Artemis that was distinctly Spartan in its ferocity, young men were flogged with whips as a religious rite. This was not punishment. This was honor. Boys and young men competed to see who could endure the most lashes without crying out, without collapsing, without showing the slightest outward sign of suffering. Crowds watched. Priests monitored. The young men who endured the longest were celebrated, their names remembered. Some ancient sources suggest that occasionally boys died at the altar, having pushed themselves past the physical limit in the refusal to yield. Whether or not those accounts are precisely accurate, the ritual itself is real. Archaeological evidence confirms the sanctuary and the rite. And it reveals something profound about Spartan spirituality. Their gods did not reward prayer or sacrifice or moral virtue in the way that other gods did. Spartan gods rewarded pain endured in silence. The moment a Spartan boy turned 18, the nature of his training shifted in a critical way. He was now old enough to begin participating in the Cryptia, the secret night hunting that served as both military training and social control. But he was also, at 18, entering the most demanding years of his physical development, and the agoge responded accordingly. The training intensified. The rations grew even more sparse. The expectations around combat skill, endurance, and tactical thinking sharpened dramatically. An 18-year-old Spartan was expected to be able to run long distances in full armor, to wrestle with men significantly older and heavier, and to demonstrate the kind of precise spear technique that could mean the difference between life and death in a phalanx. He was also expected to begin the social education of the boys beneath him, to serve as an irony for the younger agelai, perpetuating the chain of hardening that made the entire system self-sustaining. A Spartan did not finish being shaped by the agoge and then step back from it. He became part of the machine that shaped the next generation. At the age of 20, a Spartan male achieved a new status. He was now eligible for full membership in one of the communal messes, and he began to serve in the army as a full warrior. But he did not go home to live with a wife or family. He still slept in the barracks. He still ate in the common mess every night. Marriage, which was expected of Spartan men, took a form that would bewilder virtually any modern observer. Spartan newlyweds did not live together. A young married Spartan would visit his wife in secret, sneaking away from the barracks in darkness, spending only a portion of the night with her, and returning before dawn. This arrangement was intended to do several things simultaneously. It prevented domesticity from softening the warrior. It maintained the bonds of the military unit above those of the family. And the Spartans believed, based on no science whatsoever, but with complete conviction, that relationships conducted in secrecy and urgency produced stronger children. The stolen nature of marital intimacy was considered, in characteristic Spartan logic, a feature rather than a bug. The Spartan concept of marriage included customs so alien to modern sensibilities that they have shocked historians for centuries. Spartan women were not married as girls, as was common throughout the ancient world. They married in their late teens, when they had reached physical maturity and full development from years of athletic training. The marriage ceremony itself was extraordinary. The bride's hair was cut short and she was dressed in men's clothing before being left alone in a darkened room for her new husband to find. Scholars have debated the meaning of this ritual for generations. Some see it as a symbolic breaking of gender boundaries. Some see it as a transition rite marking the crossing from girlhood to womanhood. Others suggest it was designed to keep the groom calm and prevent the kind of overwhelming emotion that might compromise his mental readiness. What it unambiguously reveals is that Spartan culture was willing to subvert every other ancient Greek convention about femininity, domesticity, and marriage when those conventions seemed to interfere with the production of strong warriors and the women capable of raising them. One of the most startling aspects of Spartan marriage customs, startling even by the already extraordinary standards of Spartan social organization, was the practice that ancient sources describe whereby an older or infertile Spartan husband might encourage his wife to have children with another man. Specifically, a man admired for his physical qualities or courage. This was not considered shameful or transgressive in Sparta. It was considered rational. The goal was always the same: the production of the strongest possible next generation of Spartan warriors. Individual claims of ownership over children, individual expressions of sexual jealousy, individual pride about bloodlines, these were all considered forms of selfishness that the Spartan state had no patience for. The child that resulted was a Spartan citizen, and that was what mattered. The biological details of parentage were secondary to the civic reality of citizenship. This pragmatic approach to reproduction horrified Athens and much of the rest of Greece, which tells you something important about just how far outside the ancient Greek mainstream Spartan culture genuinely operated. A Spartan warrior achieved full citizenship status at the age of 30, after 23 years in the agoge and the military system. This is a staggering fact to sit with for a moment. In most modern societies, 30 is when a person is just beginning to build a career, to establish a family, to find their footing in the world. For a Spartan, 30 was when the formal machinery of state formation was finally, officially complete. Only at 30 could a Spartan man live with his wife and children, participate fully in the political assembly, and hold civic office. Only at 30 did he become, in the fullest legal and social sense, a citizen of Lacedaemon. And yet even then he was not free from military obligation. Sparta maintained an active military force that included men up to the age of 60. A Spartan was a soldier from 7 to 60, 53 years of military obligation, the longest obligatory service in the ancient world by a considerable margin. The city never released its claim on a man's body. Not really. Not ever. The Spartan army's approach to battlefield tactics was sophisticated far beyond the image of a simple wall of shields. Spartan commanders were trained to read terrain, to assess enemy formations, to time attacks with a precision that required not just courage but intelligence. One of the most important tactical insights the Spartans developed was the exploitation of the rightward drift that afflicted all ancient phalanx formations. Because every soldier instinctively moved slightly to the right to keep more of his body behind the protection of his neighbor's shield, entire formations would drift rightward during an advance, potentially causing tactical chaos. Spartan commanders were acutely aware of this tendency in both their own forces and enemy forces, and they developed specific formations and commands designed to counteract it. This kind of tactical self-awareness, the ability to anticipate and compensate for your own side's psychological tendencies, is a level of military sophistication that most ancient armies never achieved. It required an officer corps that thought about war not just as a test of courage but as a problem of physics and psychology simultaneously. The musical element of Spartan military life is one of the details that tends to surprise people most when they encounter it for the first time. Spartans marched into battle not to drums, not to shouted commands, but to the sound of the aulos, a double-piped instrument something like a shrill flute. Ancient sources describe Spartan armies advancing in perfect measured step to this music, their movements disciplined and unhurried even as they closed the distance to the enemy. This was not decoration or tradition for its own sake. The aulos served a precise tactical function. It regulated the pace of advance, preventing the deadly mistake of breaking into a run too early, which would disorder the phalanx and arrive at the enemy line with warriors already exhausted and out of formation. The Spartans had discovered empirically what modern military science confirms, that rhythmic sound is one of the most powerful tools for maintaining group synchronization under stress. Their use of music in battle was, like almost everything else about them, a precise answer to a specific problem dressed up in cultural clothing. The Spartan king was a figure of profound complexity, neither an absolute monarch in the Eastern sense nor a mere symbolic figurehead, but something genuinely unusual in the ancient world. Sparta had two kings simultaneously, always, from two different hereditary dynasties, the Agiad and the Eurypontid lines. They held power simultaneously, with each serving as a check on the other, and neither could act unilaterally in matters of state without the consent of the Gerousia and the Ephyrs. On the battlefield, however, one king held supreme command, and there the Spartan deference to military authority was absolute. The dual kingship was not the result of a compromise or an accident. It was a deliberate constitutional innovation designed to prevent the concentration of too much power in any single individual, because the Spartans had looked at the tyrannies that afflicted other Greek city-states and concluded, with characteristic bluntness, that one man with too much power was a danger to the community. The institution survived for centuries as one of the most unusual governmental structures in ancient history. The death of a Spartan king was accompanied by rituals of extraordinary intensity that reveal how deeply intertwined the institution of kingship was with Spartan religious and social life. When a Spartan king died, the entire city went into mourning, not the quiet, private grief of individual families, but a collective, organized, compulsory demonstration of loss. Representatives from every Spartan household, free and helot alike, were required to attend the funeral. Women were required to beat on copper cauldrons in ritual lamentation. The body of the king was treated with enormous reverence, wrapped in fine cloth and attended through a prescribed funeral ceremony. And then, strikingly, all activity in the city stopped for 10 days. No training, no assemblies, no public business. 10 days in a society that viewed idleness as a moral failing. That is how seriously Sparta took the death of a king. The message embedded in this ritual was clear. The king was not merely a military commander or a political figure. He was the living symbol of Sparta's relationship with the divine, and his death was a wound in the cosmos that required 10 days of collective grief to begin to heal. There is a dimension to Spartan religious life that is often overlooked in the popular fascination with their military culture, and that is how genuinely and deeply religious the Spartans were. They were among the most pious of all the ancient Greeks, which in a culture saturated with religious observance means something significant. Before any major military campaign, Spartan commanders performed elaborate sacrifices and read the omens with intense care. If the omens were unfavorable, an army would not march, even if the strategic or political situation demanded it. This was not superstition in the dismissive modern sense. It was a recognition that the will of the gods was the most important variable in any human enterprise, and that to ignore it was not courage but hubris, the particular pride that the Greek gods most reliably destroyed. The most famous example of this religious constraint occurred before the Battle of Marathon, when Sparta received an urgent request from Athens for military assistance against the Persian invasion and delayed their march because they were in the middle of a sacred festival. They arrived after the battle was over, and yet no one in Greece questioned their honor, because everyone understood that the gods came first. The god most central to Spartan religious identity was not Ares, the god of war, which might seem the obvious choice. It was Apollo. Apollo, god of light, of order, of music, of prophecy, was the divine patron of Lacedaemon, and the Spartans maintained a relationship with the oracle at Delphi that was more intimate and more consistently consulted than that of almost any other Greek city-state. Every major decision in Spartan history, every war, every treaty, every constitutional change, was preceded by a consultation with Delphi. The Spartans sent their founding law code, attributed to the legendary lawgiver Lycurgus, to Delphi for divine sanction before implementing it. The oracle's word was, in the truest sense, law. This reliance on Apollo is deeply revealing. The Spartans were not merely brutal, they sought order. They sought divine justification for the severity of their system. The harshness of the agoge, the violence of the cryptia, the terror exercised against the helots, all of it existed within a framework that the Spartans believed was divinely ordained, cosmically correct, and therefore not cruelty but righteousness. One of the most counterintuitive facts about Spartan culture is how profoundly it valued beauty, particularly the beauty of the male body. While other Greek city-states also celebrated physical beauty, the Spartan relationship with it was distinctive in its directness and its lack of embarrassment. Spartan warriors oiled and combed their long hair before battle, a practice that their enemies sometimes mocked until they realized what it meant. Long, well-groomed hair was a Spartan symbol of freedom. Only a free man had the time and the dignity to care for his hair. The helots were shorn. The grooming ritual before battle was not vanity. It was a statement of status, of identity, and of deliberate psychological theater. The Spartans wanted their enemies to see men who approached death with the calm elegance of people for whom dying well was more important than surviving badly. When the Persians at Thermopylae sent a scout to observe the Spartan force and he reported back that the warriors were calmly combing their hair, Xerxes reportedly laughed. His experienced advisors did not laugh. They had faced Spartans before, and they understood what the combing of hair before battle meant. The Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BC is perhaps the most famous last stand in all of human history, and yet the story that most people know about it is significantly smaller than the reality. The 300 Spartans who held the pass are the famous part, the 300 full Spartan citizens who marched with King Leonidas. But the total Greek force at Thermopylae numbered somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 men from multiple city-states. Thespians, Thebans, Arcadians, Phocians, Locrians, they all fought at the pass. When the famous final stand came on the third day, after the Spartan position had been betrayed by a local man named Ephialtes who led the Persians around the pass via a mountain path, many of the allied forces were dismissed by Leonidas. He kept the 300 Spartans, the 700 Thespians who refused to leave, and a contingent of Thebans. What happened next was not a suicidal charge born of despair. It was a calculated decision to buy time for the Greek fleet and to die in a way that would create a story so powerful it would bind Greek city-states together in determination against the Persian threat. They understood they were becoming a myth, and they chose to become it anyway. What is perhaps most psychologically fascinating about the final day at Thermopylae is what Leonidas reportedly said and did in the hours before the Persian encirclement closed. He sent away the men he believed the Greek cause could still use. He kept the Spartans and the Thespians and ordered them to eat a full meal. "For tonight we dine in Hades," he reportedly said. Then, as the Persian army of hundreds of thousands began its final advance, the Spartan force did something that stunned the Persians into momentary confusion. They charged. Not waiting behind their shields. Not bracing in a defensive line. They charged forward into the enormous Persian mass with the specific intention of reaching and killing as many Persian commanders as possible before the end came. It was tactically brilliant. Killing commanders disrupts formations and shatters morale, and it was spiritually consistent with everything the agoge had built these men to be. They fought until their spears broke, then fought with their swords, then with their bare hands and teeth according to some accounts, until the last of them was buried under Persian arrows on a small hill called Kolonos. They left behind not just their bodies. They left behind a standard of courage that entire civilizations would measure themselves against for the next 2,500 years. The aftermath of Thermopylae produced one of the most famous epitaphs in the history of human literature. Written by the poet Simonides of Thos, it was inscribed on a stone marker at the site of the last stand and reads, in translation, "Go tell the Spartans, passerby, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie." 20 words. The entire tragedy and the entire philosophy of Sparta compressed into 20 words. Obedient to their laws. Not obedient to fear. Not obedient to survival. Obedient to the laws of Lycurgus, the laws of the Phalanx, the laws that said a Spartan does not retreat, does not abandon his post, does not choose his life over his duty. The Spartans who died at Thermopylae did not die despite their culture. They died as its most perfect expression. And the epitaph Simonides gave them understood that completely. It is among the most economical and devastating pieces of writing in all of antiquity, and it would not have worked for any other people in the world, because for any other people, dying there would have been a tragedy. For Spartans, it was the fulfillment of everything they had ever been. The Spartan warrior's relationship with death was so thoroughly processed and normalized by the agoge that it amounted to a kind of philosophical position, one that predated the Stoic philosophers of Athens by centuries but shared many of the same instincts. Spartans were not encouraged to seek death. That would have been wasteful and strategically foolish. But they were trained, from childhood, to regard the fear of death as the enemy within, the internal adversary more dangerous than any external one. A man who fears death more than he fears disgrace will, eventually, make a choice that brings disgrace. A man who fears disgrace more than death will never make that choice. Not even on the worst day, not even when every instinct in his body is screaming at him to run. The Spartan system was designed to make the second type of man. And it was devastatingly effective at doing so. Modern military psychologists who study courage under fire have found that the single biggest predictor of battlefield performance under extreme stress is not physical strength, not combat training, but the strength of a soldier's social bonds and his perception of what his peers will think of him. The Spartans built an entire civilization around that insight. Spartan warriors received their shields from their mothers. This is a detail that appears in ancient sources and carries an enormous amount of cultural weight when you understand the context. The shield was the most important piece of equipment a Spartan carried, more important even than his sword, because it was the wall of the phalanx. A warrior who dropped his shield in battle was not just abandoning his own protection, he was abandoning the man beside him. The act of handing the shield from mother to son at the beginning of military service was therefore a ritual transmission of the most profound kind. The mother was not giving her son comfort or prayers or blessings. She was giving him the instrument of his duty and the weight of her expectation. Return with it or on it, the saying went. Come back victorious, your shield on your arm. Or come back dead, your body laid on the shield and carried home for burial. A Spartan who returned alive but shieldless was not a survivor. He was a coward. And a coward in Sparta had no life worth speaking of. The city's contempt for cowardice was institutional and absolute. The Spartan treatment of cowardice, those they called trizantes or tremblers, was systematically, deliberately cruel in a way that was calculated to make cowardice a fate worse than death. A trembler was stripped of virtually every right and dignity that Spartan citizenship carried. He could not hold office. He could not vote in the assembly. He could not participate in the athletic competitions that were such an important part of Spartan social life. No Spartan woman would marry him. No Spartan man would wrestle with him or eat beside him in the mess. He would be passed in the street without acknowledgement, excluded from conversation, treated as though he did not exist. And this social death would follow him for the rest of his life. There was no redemption, no act of later bravery that could fully restore what had been lost. The system was designed this way deliberately, because the Spartans understood that in the moment of maximum terror on the battlefield, a warrior would make a calculation. And they wanted that calculation to be clear. Dying in battle was survivable. Being a trembler was not. The Spartan phalanx had a specific and deliberately cultivated sound that ancient sources describe as uniquely terrifying, the sound of 10,000 shields being brought together in unison. The hoplon shield was heavy bronze over wood, and when a Spartan formation closed its ranks before battle, the crack and clatter of those shields locking edge to edge produced a sound unlike anything else on the ancient battlefield. Then the aulos would sound, that shrill, penetrating music, and the Spartans would begin to advance. Slowly. That was the detail that broke their enemies most effectively. They did not charge. They walked. They moved toward you at a measured, controlled pace, in absolute silence except for the music and the rhythmic thud of sandaled feet on Greek earth. And the psychological effect of watching 10,000 men walk toward you, calmly, in perfect order, with combed hair and a wall of shields that left no gap anywhere, was, by every ancient account, almost impossible to withstand without flinching. The calm was the weapon. The control was the terror. The Spartans had discovered that a display of absolute composure in the face of violence is more frightening than any war cry. In the moments immediately before a battle, Spartan commanders performed their final sacrifices and read the omens in full view of their troops. This public religious ritual served a function that modern military commanders achieve through pre-battle speeches. It communicated confidence, it centered the collective attention of the force, and it reminded every warrior in the formation that their commander believed the gods were with them. But the Spartan commanders did something else that is less well known. They would walk the ranks before the advance, making eye contact with each warrior, sometimes speaking a word or two, sometimes simply nodding. This was not an inspection for uniform correctness. It was a psychologically sophisticated act of recognition. The commander was saying, without words, "I see you. I know who you are. If you die today, I know your name." That act of recognition, that acknowledgement of individual identity within the collective, is something that modern military psychologists identify as enormously important for unit cohesion and willingness to fight. The Spartans did it by instinct, by tradition, because they had found through centuries of experience that it worked. The Spartan approach to military intelligence was considerably more sophisticated than their reputation for blunt force would suggest. Spartan commanders regularly employed networks of informers and scouts, particularly within helot populations and among the perioikoi, the free but non-citizen communities that surrounded Sparta and provided much of its craftwork and trade. Before a major campaign, Spartan ephors would send agents ahead to gather information about terrain, troop dispositions, supply lines, and the political temperament of populations in contested areas. The Cryptia itself, for all its darkness, was a training ground for exactly this kind of covert operation. Young men who had learned to move silently through darkness, to observe without being observed, and to act with complete independence were the perfect raw material for intelligence work. Some ancient sources suggest that Sparta maintained a sophisticated network of diplomatic relationships specifically designed to provide early warning about threats to Spartan hegemony. The image of the Spartan as a simple, direct warrior who relies on brute strength is a myth that the Spartans themselves may have deliberately cultivated, because an enemy who underestimates your intelligence is always easier to defeat. One of the most powerful psychological tools in the Spartan military arsenal was something that cost nothing and required no physical resources whatsoever: reputation. By the 5th century BC, the reputation of the Spartan army was so precisely cultivated and so thoroughly established throughout the Greek world that it functioned as a pre-battle weapon in its own right. Cities that found themselves in conflict with Sparta faced not just a military opponent but a psychological force, the accumulated weight of every story ever told about Spartan invincibility, Spartan relentlessness, Spartan disdain for pain. Some ancient sources suggest that city-states occasionally capitulated to Spartan demands specifically to avoid the combat itself, not because they believed they would necessarily lose on the battlefield, but because the psychological cost of fighting Sparta, the terror, the uncertainty, the knowledge that these men across from you genuinely did not fear dying, was considered too high even before a spear was thrown. Reputation was a strategic asset, and the Spartans managed it with the same deliberate care they brought to everything else, understanding that a city feared is, in the most practical possible sense, a city safe. The perioikoi, the dwellers around, occupy a peculiar and often overlooked position in the Spartan social structure. They were free men. They were not helots. They could own property, conduct trade, and operate businesses of all kinds. And yet they were not Spartan citizens. They had no vote in the Spartan assembly, no say in Spartan policy, no access to the political life of Lacedaemon. They lived in the towns and villages that surrounded Sparta and served as its commercial and manufacturing backbone. They made the weapons. They produced the iron. They traded with the outside world in ways that full Spartan citizens were discouraged from doing, because commercial activity was considered incompatible with the warrior identity. The perioikoi also served in the Spartan army. They fought in the phalanx alongside full Spartan citizens, often distinguishably positioned but fighting the same battles, dying the same deaths. They were, in a sense, the middle layer of a social sandwich, below the Spartiates, above the helots, dependent on Spartan military protection and providing in return the material civilization that allowed Sparta to maintain its fighting force without engaging in trade themselves. The Spartan lawgiver Lycurgus is one of the most fascinating figures in ancient history, and one of the most difficult to pin down, because virtually everything about him is disputed by modern historians. Ancient sources disagree about when he lived, what he looked like, how long he ruled, and even whether he was a single historical person or a composite figure assembled from several generations of legal reform. What is not disputed is the tradition that attributes to Lycurgus the fundamental design of the Spartan system: the agoge, the communal messes, the dual kingship, the board of ephors, the restrictions on wealth and trade, the prohibition on gold and silver coinage. If one person truly designed all of that, they were among the most consequential social architects in human history. The Spartans themselves were certain Lycurgus was real. They built him a shrine after his death. Some ancient sources say he starved himself to death specifically so that he could not return to Sparta and potentially repeal his own laws, making his death itself a final act of legislation. True or not, it is the most Spartan ending imaginable. The restrictions on wealth in Sparta were among the most radical experiments in economic leveling that the ancient world ever attempted. Lycurgan law, as transmitted through tradition, prohibited Spartan citizens from owning gold or silver coinage. Trade was to be conducted using iron currency, heavy, ungainly bars of iron called pelenoi, which were deliberately impractical to accumulate in large quantities. The message was explicit: wealth accumulation was incompatible with civic virtue. A man obsessed with money would eventually make decisions that served his wealth rather than his city. The restrictions went further. Elaborate houses were forbidden. Expensive furniture was forbidden. Fine dining outside of the common mess was discouraged. The Spartans were not the only ancient society to worry about the corrupting effects of wealth. Plato would later build elaborate philosophical arguments about the same concern, but they were the only one to address the problem through structural prohibition rather than philosophical persuasion. Did it work? For a time, remarkably well. The decline of Sparta, when it came, was accompanied precisely by a breakdown of these restrictions as wealthy Spartans found ways around them. The relationship between Sparta and Athens during the 5th century BC is one of the great rivalries of the ancient world, and its complexity is far greater than the simple opposition of military culture versus intellectual culture that popular history sometimes suggests. The two cities were, for long stretches of the Persian Wars, genuine allies, fighting side by side at Plataea in 479 BC in the campaign that finally drove the Persian land army from Greece. The mutual respect between Spartan and Athenian commanders during that conflict was real and documented. What converted this alliance into the catastrophic conflict of the Peloponnesian War, which lasted nearly 3 decades and ultimately destroyed the power of both cities, was not ideology. It was fear. Athens, flushed with its naval victories against Persia and the growing wealth of its empire, began to look like exactly the kind of dominant power that Sparta's entire foreign policy was designed to prevent. The Spartans made the decision to go to war against Athens not from hatred but from strategic calculation, and they spent the next generation paying the full price of a calculation that turned out to be correct about the threat and catastrophically wrong about the cost. One of the most enduring myths about Sparta, and there are many, is the idea that Spartan warriors were invincible. They were not. They lost battles. They lost them in ways that shocked the ancient world precisely because Spartan invincibility had become such an established assumption. The most shattering of these defeats occurred at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC, where the Theban general Epaminondas deployed a revolutionary tactical innovation: a concentrated column of warriors called the Sacred Band, 300 elite soldiers who had trained together with a devotion rivaling the Spartans themselves, placed at the decisive point of the line at overwhelming depth. The Spartan right wing, traditionally the most powerful element of a Greek battle line, was smashed. Over 400 Spartan citizens were killed, including the commanding general Cleombrotus. 400 Spartiates. In a city that by this point had perhaps 2,000 full citizens left, losing 400 in a single afternoon was not a military setback. It was a civilizational wound. Sparta never fully recovered. The loss at Leuctra marks, for most historians, the beginning of the end of Spartan hegemony, and the end was shockingly swift after it began. The Sacred Band of Thebes, which dealt Sparta this shattering blow at Leuctra, was itself a fascinating mirror image of certain Spartan social technologies. The 150 pairs of warriors who made up the Sacred Band were bound together not merely by training but by romantic attachment. Each pair consisted of 2 men in a committed relationship, fighting beside one another. The Theban general Gorgidas and his successor Pelopidas organized the band on the philosophical premise that men fighting beside their lovers would never yield, because cowardice in the presence of the beloved was considered the worst possible failure. The sacred band was undefeated for 40 years. Their final defeat, at the Battle of Kyrenia in 338 BC, at the hands of Philip II of Macedon and his son Alexander, ended with them dying in formation, none having broken ranks, their bodies found exactly where they had stood. Philip of Macedon reportedly wept when he saw the field. Even a Macedonian king who had just won a decisive victory found himself undone by the sight of 300 men who had chosen death over dishonor. The Spartans would have understood that completely. The helot population of Sparta included a subgroup whose relationship with their Spartan masters was uniquely complex. The Messenian helots, descendants of a proud and independent people who had been conquered by Sparta in a series of brutal wars during the 8th and 7th centuries BC. The Messenians had not always been slaves. They had their own kings, their own culture, their own heroes and traditions. Their reduction to helot status was not the natural order of things. It was a historical wound inflicted within living cultural memory. This is why the Messenian helots were perennially more dangerous than the Laconian helots, why the revolts that terrified Sparta most consistently came from Messenia, and why, when Sparta's power finally broke in the 4th century BC, the liberation of Messenia by the Theban general Epaminondas was greeted by the Messenians themselves with the kind of overwhelming joy that only people who remember exactly what was taken from them can feel. Epaminondas rebuilt the ancient Messenian capital of Messene, fortified it with walls so massive that they still stand today, specifically to create a permanent barrier against any Spartan attempt to re-enslave the population. He understood that a people remembering their freedom is more dangerous than any army. In the decades following Leuctra, Sparta's citizen population entered a crisis that modern historians call the problem of oliganthropia, a shortage of men. This shortage had been building for generations, driven by a perfect storm of demographic pressures. The harsh infant selection process removed potential citizens before birth. The dangerous training of the agoge killed some of those who entered it. Battles removed warriors permanently. And the strict economic requirements of citizenship, the monthly contribution to the common mess, were pushing men out of full citizen status as land became concentrated in fewer hands through inheritance and intermarriage. By the mid-4th century, Sparta may have had fewer than 1,500 full citizen warriors. A city that had sent 8,000 soldiers to fight at Plataea in 479 BC could now barely field a fraction of that number. The machine that had been designed to produce invincible warriors was consuming itself. Its very success, the extraordinary selectivity, the brutal filtration, the deliberate sacrifice of potential citizens to the ideal of perfection, had left it with too few men to defend the civilization that the system was supposed to protect. Spartan women, in the absence of their warrior husbands, managed everything. This is not a poetic overstatement. It is a functional description of Spartan economic and social reality. The Spartan citizen class was, by design, entirely focused on military activity. Men did not farm. Men did not trade. Men did not manage household finances in the day-to-day operational sense. Women did all of this. Spartan women supervised the helot farmers who worked the land. They managed the storage and distribution of agricultural output. They negotiated with the perioikoi craftsmen who supplied household needs. They raised the children. Both the sons they would eventually surrender to the agoge and the daughters they would raise to be strong enough to do the same. The economic competence of Spartan women was not incidental to the system. It was the system. Without women managing the entire domestic economy, the men could not have sustained the commitment to full-time military life that the Spartan model demanded. And yet ancient Athens looked at this arrangement and found it scandalous. The irony of a society that celebrated male dominance while depending entirely on female competence for its economic survival apparently escaped the Athenians completely. There is a category of Spartan social life that ancient sources hint at but that historians have long struggled to fully characterize: the complex system of mentorship and social bonds between older and younger warriors. Within the agoge, established relationships of guidance existed between adult Spartan men and the boys in training, relationships that went beyond the formal irony structure and involved genuine personal investment and care. An older warrior might take a particular interest in a younger one, teaching him subtleties of tactics or ethics that the formal training system did not cover, advocating for him, and accepting some share of moral responsibility for how the young man developed as a person and a warrior. These relationships were considered an important part of Spartan social formation, the transmission not just of physical skills but of the intangible qualities of character, judgment, and courage that cannot be taught in a classroom but can sometimes be demonstrated in a relationship. The Spartans were deeply aware that the agoge produced physical warriors but that something more intimate was required to produce wise ones. One of the darkest and least discussed aspects of Spartan society is what happened to Spartan men who were taken prisoner. In most ancient societies, being captured was an unfortunate but comprehensible outcome of battle. Prisoners could be ransomed, enslaved, or eventually released. In Sparta, being taken prisoner was effectively equivalent to death, because return to Sparta after capture was more terrible than death itself. The trembler's fate awaited a returned prisoner with a particular intensity, because his capture implied that he had chosen survival over the correct Spartan option of dying in place. After the Battle of Sphacteria in 425 BC, where a small force of Spartan warriors was surrounded by Athenian forces on an island and, after extraordinary resistance, surrendered, the ancient world was stunned. Spartans surrendering was almost literally unthinkable. When the survivors returned to Sparta, the city did not embrace them. The ephors stripped them of their civic rights, and some sources suggest that the returned warriors were so consumed by shame that they avoided public spaces entirely, wearing their disgrace like a physical deformity. The system that had made them warriors had also made the alternative to death virtually unlivable. The physical landscape of ancient Sparta is itself a revealing fact about the Spartan mindset. While Athens, Corinth, and other great Greek cities built elaborate walls, impressive temples, and grand civic monuments that signaled their wealth and cultural ambition, ancient Sparta was strikingly unimpressive to look at. Thucydides, the great Athenian historian, noted that if Sparta were ever to be abandoned and only its ruins left behind, future generations would find it hard to believe the city had ever been as powerful as it was, because its physical infrastructure did not match its historical significance. Sparta had no great walls for much of its history. Spartan warriors were the walls, the Spartan leaders proudly declared, and by this they meant that no physical barrier was necessary for a city defended by men who would never retreat. The temples that existed were relatively modest. The streets were unpaved. The private houses were plain. A city that invested everything in the human body and nothing in stone had nothing to show posterity except its reputation. And reputation, as it turns out, is exactly what Sparta left behind. No other ruins. Just the story. The Spartan relationship with iron is worth examining more closely because it was a defining material in their civilization in ways that go well beyond the obvious military application. Spartan currency was iron. Spartan weapons were iron. The iron bars used as currency were deliberately made heavy and impractical. You could not carry very many of them, you could not hide them easily, and you could not use them for luxury goods. The iron economy was an anti-wealth mechanism as much as a monetary system. It made the accumulation of capital physically cumbersome and socially unrewarding. When Sparta did eventually begin to interact more freely with the broader Greek and Mediterranean economy, as it was forced to do after its military campaigns stretched its resources, the corrupting influence that its lawmakers had feared arrived with the gold and silver that began to circulate in Spartan hands. The historian Plutarch describes this process as a kind of moral disease that entered Sparta from outside, carried in coins. The Spartans themselves had a name for it. They called it pleonexia, the hunger for more. And when pleonexia took hold among the Spartan elite, the entire social architecture that Lycurgus had built began to quietly come apart. The role of the Spartan ephors, 5 elected magistrates who held enormous power in the Spartan constitutional system, is one of the aspects of Spartan governance that most surprises people familiar only with the warrior mythology. The ephors could overrule the kings. They could arrest the kings. They could put the kings on trial. They served for 1 year, could not be re-elected, and came from the full citizen population. not from any aristocratic class. Every year, upon taking office, the new ephors formally declared war on the helots, renewing the legal authorization for the cryptia. Every month, the ephors evaluated the body condition of the full citizen soldiers, and men who appeared to have grown soft or fat could be publicly censured. The ephors could summon any Spartan citizen to appear before them and answer questions about their conduct, and the citizen had no choice but to comply. In a city otherwise famous for its contempt for elaborate political machinery, the ephor system was a surprisingly sophisticated check on power, designed to prevent both royal tyranny and the tyranny of individual wealth and ambition. It was, in its own way, a form of accountability, brutal and blunt, but real. The Spartan education system did not neglect the mind entirely, though it focused on it very differently than Athens did. Where Athenian education emphasized philosophy, rhetoric, mathematics, and the arts, Spartan education emphasized a particular kind of practical intelligence, the ability to read people, to make fast decisions under pressure, and to communicate with devastating precision. Spartan boys were exposed to poetry, specifically the martial poetry of Tyrtaeus, a war poet whose verses were so perfectly aligned with Spartan values that some ancient sources claim he was sent to Sparta specifically by the Delphic oracle to help the city survive a crisis. The poetry was not studied as literature. It was memorized as a psychological technology, a way of encoding courage, duty, and contempt for cowardice directly into the emotional memory of growing warriors. Tyrtaeus' most famous lines celebrate dying young on the battlefield as the highest possible form of glory and describe the old man who survives his sons as the most pitiable figure in the world. This was not rhetoric. For the Spartans, it was theology. The mythological hero most beloved by Sparta was Heracles, Hercules in the Roman tradition, whose 12 labors were interpreted by Spartans not as supernatural adventures but as a template for the kind of person that human discipline and suffering could produce. Heracles was mortal, or at least half-mortal. He was not born invincible. He became extraordinary through struggle, through endurance, through facing and defeating things that should have been impossible. For the Spartans, this was the most important story in all of Greek mythology because it said exactly what the agoge said, that hardship, properly applied, transforms ordinary human material into something extraordinary. The Spartan kings of both dynasties claimed descent from Heracles. The Aegead and Eurypontid lines both traced their lineage back to the demigod hero. This was not merely dynastic propaganda. It was a statement of belief that the capacity for the extraordinary lived in Spartan blood, that every Spartan warrior was, in some real sense, a descendant of the man who had held up the sky. What that kind of mythological self-conception does to a culture's sense of its own possibilities is difficult to overstate. Spartan warriors going into battle performed a specific physical preparation that has fascinated military historians. They anointed themselves with olive oil. Not just for the religious significance, though olive oil was sacred in Greek culture, but for a very practical reason. Oil on skin makes the body slippery, harder to grip, harder to grapple. In the close quarters violence of phalanx combat, when formations collapsed and individual fighting began, a warrior whose skin was well-oiled was genuinely harder to seize and wrestle down. This was a detail that reveals how comprehensively the Spartans thought about combat. Every aspect, from the angle of the spear to the condition of the skin, had been considered and optimized. The oil was also a symbol of care. The oiling of the body before battle was the warrior's final act of preparation, the last thing done before the killing started. It was part of the same ritual as the combing of the hair, a deliberate, dignified, unhurried act that communicated to everyone watching, including the warrior himself, that the man who does this is in control. He is not panicking. He is preparing. There is a difference, and the Spartans understood it viscerally. The question of literacy in Sparta is one that historians approach carefully, because the evidence is incomplete and the implications are significant. Spartan boys were taught to read and write. Literacy was not abandoned in favor of physical education. But the relationship with the written word was different in Sparta than anywhere else in Greece. The Spartans were famously reluctant to commit their laws and practices to writing. Lycurgan tradition, as recorded by Plutarch, explicitly prohibited writing down the constitution. The laws were to be carried in the hearts and minds of the citizens, not stored on tablets where they could be argued over, amended, or ignored. This oral tradition was a form of conservatism, a way of ensuring that the laws remained alive and immediate rather than becoming a historical document subject to scholarly interpretation. It also had the practical effect of making Spartan culture more difficult for outsiders to understand and infiltrate. What you cannot read, you cannot study and counter. The deliberate restriction of textual culture was itself, in characteristically Spartan fashion, a strategic choice with a specific defensive purpose. The Spartan practice of sending ambassadors and advisors to other Greek city-states is a dimension of their history that receives very little attention but was actually enormously consequential. Sparta had a deeply conservative interest in the stability of other city-states. Revolutionary change elsewhere in Greece tended to produce instability that threatened Spartan security. Spartan ambassadors therefore frequently appeared in cities experiencing political crises, offering guidance, mediation, and occasionally military backing to the conservative factions that wanted to maintain existing social hierarchies. The famous Spartan policy of tearing down the walls of cities they defeated, they demanded this of Athens at the end of the Peloponnesian War, was not just military precaution. It was a statement that physical defensive infrastructure was a form of hubris, an artificial substitute for the kind of military virtue that Sparta believed should be the only true defense of a city. Tearing down walls was Sparta's way of telling a defeated city, your protection now comes from us, or from becoming more like us. It was domination through ideology as much as through force. There is a Spartan tradition around the birth of their legendary constitution that offers one of the most psychologically rich stories in ancient history. When Lycurgus had designed the new laws and wanted to test whether the Spartan people would commit to them, he reportedly summoned the citizens and asked them to promise, on their sacred honor, to maintain the laws exactly as he had laid them out until he returned from a consultation with the oracle at Delphi. The citizens swore. Lycurgus went to Delphi. He received the oracle's blessing on the laws. And then, according to the tradition that Plutarch records with evident admiration, he never returned. He spent the rest of his life in voluntary exile, in foreign lands, never eating Spartan food or walking Spartan streets again, ensuring by his permanent absence that the oath the citizens had sworn could never technically be lifted. When he died, it is said he gave instructions for his body to be thrown into the sea rather than brought home for burial, because if his remains were returned to Sparta, someone might argue that his return had fulfilled the oath, releasing the people from their commitment. Even in death, Lycurgus was legislating. The seasonal festivals of Sparta were among the most intense and unusual in the ancient Greek world, reflecting the particular character of a culture that transformed even celebration into a form of training and display. The Gymnopediae, the festival of naked youths, was a 3-day celebration held in the heat of high summer during which choruses of naked boys, young men, and older warriors performed athletic dances and martial displays under the blazing Laconian sun. This was not a festival of leisure or pleasure. It was a public performance of endurance and physical perfection, conducted in the worst conditions: full summer heat, no shade, no rest, specifically to demonstrate that the Spartan body had been so thoroughly conditioned that even its celebrations were tests. Visitors to Sparta during the Gymnopediae reportedly described the spectacle with a combination of amazement and unease. The dances were intense and demanding. The heat was punishing, and the Spartans performed as though both were entirely irrelevant, which for them they were. The Spartans had an elaborate and sophisticated relationship with the concept of shame that functioned as the invisible architecture of their entire social system. Every other Greek city-state also recognized shame as a social force. The Greek concept of eidos encompassed both shame and reverence, and was considered fundamental to civilized behavior. But Sparta elevated shame to the status of governance. The entire enforcement mechanism of Spartan social norms was shame-based. You did not stay in formation because the law required it. You stayed in formation because stepping back would be the most shameful thing you could do in the eyes of every man beside you, and they would see it, and they would remember it, and they would not forget it, and you would have to live with that for the rest of your life. You did not return home with your shield because the law required it. You returned with your shield because your mother's eyes when you left told you in absolute clarity what her eyes would say if you came back without it. The entire social system was externalized moral pressure, and it worked because Spartans were raised from birth to care, above all else, about how they appeared in the estimation of the people they respected. The year 371 BC, the year of Leuctra, marked a turning point not just militarily but demographically, and the demographic crisis that followed Leuctra accelerated trends that had been building for over a century. As Spartan citizen numbers dwindled, the city began making expedient exceptions to rules that had previously been treated as inviolable. Men who had lost their land, and with it the ability to contribute to the common mess, were sometimes quietly allowed to retain a shadow of citizenship. Freed helots who had served the Spartan state were sometimes granted a form of limited status. The rigid categories that had defined Spartan society, full Spartiates, hypomiones, perioikoi, helots, began to blur at the edges as political necessity pushed against constitutional purity. This blurring was, paradoxically, both a sign of Sparta's adaptability and a sign of its decline. A system built on the absolute clarity of categories, on the unwavering certainty about who was a warrior and who was not, began to lose its definitional confidence. And a society that loses confidence in what it is already well on the way to becoming something else. Spartan women's economic power, already noted as substantial, grew even more pronounced in the 4th and 3rd centuries BC as the citizen population shrank. Women in Sparta could inherit land, and with fewer male heirs surviving the agoge and the battlefield, more and more land accumulated in female hands. By the time of the Macedonian period, some ancient sources suggest that Spartan women controlled as much as 2/5 of all the land in Laconia. This was an extraordinary concentration of economic power in female hands by any standard of the ancient world, and it had complex and somewhat paradoxical effects on Spartan society. On one hand, it preserved female influence and independence. On the other hand, it accelerated the concentration of wealth and the breakdown of the Lycurgan ideal of economic equality, because wealthy women, just like wealthy men, began living in ways that the old laws had been designed to prevent. The very success of Spartan women at surviving and prospering in a world designed to consume men contributed to the erosion of the equality that had once made Sparta distinctive. The relationship between Alexander the Great and Sparta is one of the fascinating might-have-beens of ancient history. When Alexander launched his campaign against the Persian Empire in 334 BC, he gathered a coalition of Greek city-states, but not Sparta. Sparta refused to participate. Refused, characteristically, without elaborate explanation. The Spartans sent no troops. They offered no alliance. They maintained a studied neutrality that was, in its own way, a statement: we do not join other men's conquests. When Alexander sent the Persian spoils he captured back to the Greek cities and dedicated them to Athens with a specific inscription noting that they were won from the barbarians of Asia, mentioning all the Greek allies by name, he notably did not mention Sparta. It was a deliberate slight. The Spartans, in the meantime, attempted their own small rebellion against Macedonian hegemony, led by King Agis III, while Alexander was deep in Asia. It was crushed efficiently by Alexander's regent Antipater. When the news reached Alexander, he reportedly dismissed it as a war of mice. Sparta, which had once been the unquestioned hegemon of Greece, had been reduced to a sideshow in a world that had moved on without it. Yet even in decline, even in the era when Spartan military power was a shadow of what it had been, the reputation persisted. City-states that had spent generations living in terror of Spartan armies continued to behave deferentially towards Spartan ambassadors long after there was any material reason to do so. The inertia of reputation is one of the most powerful forces in political history, and Sparta's reputation was so thoroughly established and so deeply embedded in the political consciousness of the ancient world that it continued to generate diplomatic and psychological effects for decades after the military reality behind it had eroded. This is itself a profound insight about power, that the most durable form of power is not military or economic but reputational. Because it costs nothing to maintain once established, it operates continuously without requiring any action, and it lives in the minds of people who may never have directly experienced the thing that created the reputation. Sparta taught the ancient world that lesson more thoroughly than any other city. In the 3rd century BC, Sparta produced a pair of reforming kings, Agis IV and Cleomenes III, who attempted to revive the Lycurgan system in its original austerity and in doing so created one of the most dramatic political stories of the Hellenistic age. Agis IV came to the throne around 244 BC and immediately proposed a radical program of reform, cancellation of debts, redistribution of land, expansion of the citizen body, and a return to the traditional agoge and communal messes. The proposal was revolutionary, and it terrified Sparta's wealthy elite, who had spent generations quietly accumulating the land and wealth that the Lycurgan system was supposed to prevent. Agis was outmaneuvered politically, arrested, and executed, strangled in prison at around 20 years old, having never been tried or convicted of any crime. His mother and grandmother, who had supported his reform program, were executed immediately afterward. When the executioner came for his grandmother, she reportedly insisted on being the first to die, so that she would not have to watch. Even in the moment of political defeat and personal extermination, the women of Sparta performed composure as a form of defiance. Cleomenes III, who came to power a few years after Agis's execution, learned from his predecessor's failure and took a more direct route to reform. Rather than trying to work through constitutional channels, he used his control of the army to execute the ephors, all 5 of them, in a single night, and then imposed his reform program by royal decree. He cancelled debts, redistributed land, expanded the citizen body, and rebuilt the agoge. For a time, it actually worked. Cleomenes' reformed Sparta won a series of stunning military victories that briefly revived Spartan hegemony over the Peloponnese and terrified the other Greek city-states into calling for Macedonian intervention. It was Antigonus of Macedon who finally crushed Cleomenes at the Battle of Sellasia in 222 BC, the first time a foreign army had ever entered Laconia and defeated a Spartan force on Spartan soil. Cleomenes fled to Egypt and eventually died there by suicide after a failed escape attempt. He was the last Spartan king who could be said to have genuinely fought for Sparta in the way that the traditions of Lycurgus demanded. The helots were not a monolithic, passive population silently enduring their subjugation. They resisted. They ran away when opportunity permitted. They provided intelligence to Spartan enemies when circumstances allowed. They rose in rebellion multiple times across the centuries of their subjugation, and in moments of Spartan military crisis, particularly during the earthquake of 464 BC and the revolts that followed, they came terrifyingly close to succeeding. What is remarkable is that Spartan culture preserved such detailed awareness of helot resistance while simultaneously maintaining the fiction that helot subjugation was the natural order of things. The annual declaration of war, the Cryptia, the systematic elimination of strong helot individuals, these were not the actions of a society confident in its natural superiority. They were the actions of a society that knew, in the cold, clear part of its awareness, that what it was doing was artificial, maintained by continuous violence, and perpetually at risk of reversal. The terror in the Spartan system was not entirely directed outward. Some of it was the terror of a ruling class that could not afford to sleep soundly. The very end of the Spartan agoge as a living institution is a melancholy story. After the Roman conquest of Greece and the absorption of Sparta into the Roman world, the agoge continued, but transformed into something that had lost its original purpose while retaining its forms. Roman tourists visited Sparta specifically to watch the flogging ceremony at the altar of Artemis Orthia. What had once been a sacred test of Spartan endurance had become a spectator sport, a performance of ancient severity for the entertainment of Romans who had heard the legends. Boys were flogged more severely than ever before, not because the tradition had grown harsher in its principles, but because the audiences demanded a more dramatic show, and the Spartan priests accommodated them. This transformation from sacred ordeal to tourist attraction is perhaps the saddest thing that happened to Spartan culture. The form remained. The soul had departed. The boys bled for Roman applause rather than Spartan glory, and if they knew the difference, and perhaps they did, they endured it without complaint, because complaining was something that Spartans had never done, not even when everything they were had been reduced to theater. There is one more dimension of the Spartan story that modern history tends to overlook, and it is perhaps the most humanizing. The Spartans were not entirely without tenderness. Their emotional lives were simply expressed in forms that other cultures found difficult to recognize as emotional at all. There are accounts of Spartan warriors weeping, not for their own pain, but for fallen comrades. There are accounts of Spartan mothers holding sons who came back broken and finding in their silence something that needed no words. The bonds formed in the agoge, between boys who had suffered together, who had stolen food together, who had stood shield to shield through the coldest nights and the most terrifying battles, were bonds of a depth and intensity that most human beings never experience. The Spartan system did not destroy the capacity for love. It redirected it entirely toward the group. And in the redirected form it took, fierce, loyal, unexpressed in any soft or comfortable way, it was perhaps the most powerful form of human attachment that the ancient world ever produced. The men who held at Thermopylae held not for abstract duty or political loyalty. They held for each other. For the men whose names they knew. For the brothers the agoge had made them. The legacy of Sparta has been weaponized, romanticized, misunderstood, and genuinely illuminated by each generation that has encountered it. Modern military organizations study the agoge as a model of elite training. Modern sports teams post Molin Labe on locker room walls. Political movements of every ideological stripe have claimed Spartan precedent for their preferred vision of social organization. None of them are entirely wrong, and none of them are entirely right, because Sparta was too contradictory, too extreme, and too specific to its historical context to serve cleanly as a model for anything. It was a society that achieved extraordinary things through methods that caused extraordinary suffering. It produced men of almost incomprehensible courage through a process that was, in many of its aspects, genuinely cruel. It maintained a civilization of proud warriors on the backs of an enslaved people who are largely invisible in the histories that celebrate Sparta. These contradictions are not bugs in the Spartan story. They are the story. And a full reckoning with Sparta requires holding all of it at once. The glory and the horror, the courage and the terror, the superhuman endurance and the inhuman cost. And so we come, at last, to what remains. Not the walls, because Sparta built none worth preserving. Not the art, because Sparta produced little. Not the philosophy, because Sparta discouraged the kind of elaborate intellectual culture that leaves written records. What remains of Sparta is precisely what Sparta always intended to leave: a name, a set of ideas, a standard, the word laconic, embedded in every language that descended from the European tradition. The phrase Molin Labe, still used by warriors who have never heard of Leonidas. The story of 300 men who chose a hill to die on because dying well was more important than surviving poorly. A story so perfectly told that it has outlasted every Persian king and every Athenian philosopher and every Macedonian conqueror who was alive on the day it happened. Sparta understood something about legacy that most civilizations have missed, that what you build in stone disappears, but what you build in human beings, in their courage, their discipline, their willingness to face the worst thing with the best version of themselves, echoes forever. The city is gone. The echo has not stopped. Stand in any place where men choose to hold their ground against impossible odds, and you are standing in Sparta. You always will be.